I think we are at 4 o'clock. Shall we just start off then, waiting for other people to join? Sarah, what do you think?
Sure. If you think we should wait for a few minutes, that's fine too. Whatever, you know.
We'll wait for a couple of minutes before we.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Thank you. I think, Sarah, I think we should start off because I know your time is also valuable. So we have around 15 people on, and some more may join. And anyway, we are recording this on YouTube. So if anyone wants to kind of um, hear this, they can always go and access that link and get it. I don't want to waste time in introducing you. That is why I had put up your profile right on the landing page. Sarah, it's always a pleasure to hear from you, and we are very privileged to have you here today. Over to you.
Likewise, Philip, and thanks a lot for inviting me to talk about this subject. And while the subject of science communication is quite broad and laden with a lot of definitions and models, I guess in the interest of time and also the objective of and the purpose of this webinar, I will steer clear of these definitions and models and maybe focus more on providing some food for thought and also some practical pointers on how we could effectively communicate complex scientific concepts. So with that, I will probably share my screen and yes, hello everybody, and I just hope that you're all doing well and staying safe and well, and that your advocacy kits are coming along well as well. So Philip, I should be able to share my screen, right? Yeah, I can.
Yes.
Can you see my screen?
No.
Screen visible?
No,
Oops.
it's yes, yes.
Okay.
Though it would be great if you made it full screen.
Oh, it is full screen. Okay, let me. Gosh. Is it full screen now?
It's perfect.
Okay, great. So I'll move on. So right, so this comic strip here actually is quite widely used to drive this point home that subject matter experts generally tend to carry the knowledge of curse, and which is nothing but a cognitive bias that assumes that individual that you're communicating to have the prerequisite background or knowledge to understand what you're saying. And I think as much as this is quite funny, it is very, very true. And that's where also why effective communication of science, of evidence, of facts, scientific facts and principles becomes very important. And you know, and we have to constantly reflect on how we could improve our communication to our audience, you know, as a professional, as a subject matter expert. And so let's begin by perhaps reflecting on you know, what, you know, on the reason as to why we need to communicate in the first place. So you could, you know, you could unmute yourself, or you could drop your answers in the chat. We'll just take a few minutes for this. Not sure if I can. Yeah, okay. To convey information, to convince others about our point of view. That's right. We communicate for influencing action or change in behavior, to share ideas, better understanding. That's great. Anyone else? Any other thoughts on, you know, why, you know, why do we communicate? Communicate to understand each other. That's a really good one. Yeah. So I guess what I want us to reflect on is a very important aspect of communication, and that, I guess, that would really be the central message and idea of my presentation today, is really our audience. And so, you know, like you said, we communicate to inform, instruct, educate, inspire, entertain, influence, persuade, and so on. But who is that we are trying to influence or inform or educate? And that's really our audience. So I guess where we stumble a lot is you know, not really understanding our audience and who we are communicating to in the first place. And so I guess understanding your audience, where they're coming from, what kind of context, you know, be it sociocultural or economic context they are from, what are their preconceived notions or beliefs or values that they hold, you know, what kind of information, prior scientific information or knowledge do they possess, and also the preferred language in you know, that they would like to kind of communicate in, or prefer to receive information in. So I think we need to, as you know, experts or subject matter experts, we need to understand our audience well before we even set out to design any communication strategy or advocacy. And so I quite liked this little you know, representation of science communication, where it's really the two worlds of science and communication coming together. And as we know, science is really based on research, it needs evidence, experts, institutions, and it's obviously based on facts. Whereas communication is really more about the values that we hold, or the way we interpret or make sense of the world. It needs filters. It is laden with emotions, and it also elicits feelings. So it's really the coming together of science and communication, and that's why so this marriage is so tricky and challenging, because it's really a marriage between facts and feelings. And when we look at how generally experts tend to communicate is, in our academic settings, we have a certain style. So when you look at these two pyramids, can you guess which is the style of a scientist or subject matter specialist, and what is the style of the in the other pyramid? Because I can't see the responses, I am, or maybe I can. Any thoughts? So the first, this pyramid, as you can see, is how we tend to communicate in academic world, right? So you provide a background, you provide supporting details, or or your evidence, and then what do you conclude from all that you've done, the research that you've done. And that's really how we tend to communicate. Whereas when we are talking to a non-specialist or a non-science public, what they really want to understand is the bottom line. Why should they even be interested in what you're trying to say? And so that's really the bottom line is what needs to come first, and then you support that bottom line with why should they care, and then provide the evidence and the facts to support your message. And so you can see already that there's a difference in the way we are trained to communicate, and the way in which you must communicate to a non-specialist or a non-expert audience. And it's very important at this point to acknowledge and realize that we don't have to dumb down our science, but have to use the right kind of language and style. So with that, I'm just going to share some of my thoughts and ideas on how we could navigate the complexity of public communication of science. And like I mentioned right at the start of my presentation, that it's extremely important to understand your audience well and respect the knowledge that they bring with them, or respect the values and beliefs that they carry with them, and have to be very careful about also not talking down. We also have to address the question of so what, like I mentioned in that previous slide in the pyramid, of why should your audience be interested in this? How does it impact them? How does how can they relate to this message or this problem that you are trying to convey to them? And so you have to address this question early on. It's also important to avoid jargon. Of course, this is something that we most often struggle with, is how much do you need to simplify, and what kind of language do you need to use to do this. So again, it's a process. I mean, I think there is no easy answer to this. I think you have to do it, you have to practice, and you have to practice it enough to be able to come up with your own recipe and your own template of what works and what doesn't work, and it would change depending on the audience that you're trying to engage or communicate to. So of course, this is something that I think we, all of us in science, or health, medical sciences, have to be very, very mindful of, is to avoid jargon. And another very important aspect is language, and we have to be very aware of the kind of lexicon we use in science, and that it cannot you cannot use the same words or vocabulary when you're talking to someone in who's outside of your discipline, because for them those words may mean something else. For example, theory in academic research would mean something completely different, whereas in the public domain it means a guess that you're making this is my theory about this, whereas in more research academic setups it's more an educated guess based on some evidence, some prior observation. And so there's quite a large difference in just how these words are interpreted. And similarly in words like significant, is it statistically significant? for us, whereas significant could just mean something of epic proportions to a non-science public. So we have to be very careful about the words that we use in our communication as well, and what they would mean to your audience. And so of course, use of stories, analogies, and visuals are useful sometimes to unpack and uncomplicate complex scientific concepts and ideas, because it helps your receiver, it could be your listener, it could be reader, or your viewer, to imagine that concept clearly. And so you could use a lot of analogies, you could use a lot of visuals, but you have to be very careful about using the right kind of analogies, and it should not confuse or make that concept ambiguous or lead to some sort of misinformation. And so you have to be very careful about when you're coming up with these kind of analogies or stories or visuals, that it should not mislead your audience. So while they're very effective, if they're used properly, they could also mislead your audience. So you have to be very careful about about using these. And of course, I guess another very important aspect, which I'm sure you must have heard again and again as part of this program, is you have to make the message or the story that you're trying to convey relevant and meaningful to your audience. And so for that, you have to prioritize information. You might have a lot to share, but you have to really understand where your audience is coming from and what is that they will find more relatable, more useful. And so you have to, if you have a large amount of information to share, you may want to kind of prioritize and select information that your audience will be able to understand and relate to the most. And then I would also like to share some more points that you may want to keep in mind, and some of which makes the whole process of science communication perhaps even more challenging. And that is, the science communication researchers have actually shown that just using simple language is not enough for understanding. So because facts actually can be interpreted in different ways by different people, depending on the values and beliefs that they hold. So it's not just enough for you to simplify science, but you'll have to really look into how do you contextualize it, how do you make it, how can you really derive meaning out of what you're trying to convey to your audience. It's also important to bear in mind that for someone to apply the scientific information that you're sharing with them, it must fit with how they see the world and the kind of values they hold in the first place. So knowledge itself may do very little to help people to kind of apply science or like science, and so you have to really bear these points in mind, that it's not so transactional that you share the information and then you think that your audience will take it and apply it to their life. So there's a lot more to communicating and engaging people in science than just simplifying than science. So that's why science communication or public engagement with science is increasingly being seen as a way to start a dialogue, a way to engage people in science. And of course, there is a lot of work that is out there, and there's a lot of methodologies that are out there that show that stories and art play a critical role, because they elicit emotions in people, and they help people connect to the message that you're trying to convey. So it's a really good idea to use storytelling and using visual art to convey your complex science ideas. So some of the challenges of public communication of AMR, I'm sure, through the process of this, through this program, you may have reflected on, what it is that makes AMR a difficult concept to communicate to a lay person or to a non-specialist audience. So any thoughts that you might want to share based on, the kind of exploration that you may have done on communicating this problem? Again, I mean, feel free to unmute yourself, or you could also drop your thoughts and ideas and views in the chat box, whatever you prefer. Okay, so
be a very communicative crowd.
yeah, and it doesn't help that I can't see people. So yeah, so it's a faceless nature of AMR is very difficult. That's absolutely right. Haifa, thank you so much for sharing. Any other thoughts? Any other obstacles that you may have faced while trying to frame AMR for public communication? All right. So again, I think maybe we can have a discussion later on, but let me just share some challenges that I think are quite critical and something that I have kind of come across through our program, Superheroes Against Superbugs, where we work with young children. And some of the absolutely, Sairu, this is one of the points that I'm also going to make is about, helping people realize that it's an urgent need. So let's just look at some of the challenges. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list. And, please add anything that you think you may have come across and that's not presented here on the slide. So, of course, I think one of the major challenges that when we spoke about and talked about AMR was that, first of all, it seemed very complex and abstract. People couldn't really relate to this problem as something that was affecting them. And of course, the problem of AMR, because it's so complex and so multifaceted, multidimensional, it it meant different things. It meant differently to different audiences also. And so, for example, in one of these reports that Wellcome Trust did on reframing resistance, which I would encourage you all to go through as part of developing these toolkits. They surveyed a lot of people in multiple many different countries, and and they realized that, again, this was something that came across as being a problem, that people are unable to relate to AMR because it's so complex and abstract. It's also AMR is not a disease per se. It's really a natural phenomena that's demonstrated by microorganisms. So how do you kind of translate that and say that it's a big public health problem? So that's again a very big communication challenge. And like of course it was Sairu said, and Haifa also mentioned that it's the sense of personal jeopardy and urgency is missing. So a lot of people think that I'm healthy, AMR is not going to affect me. Just like the same what we saw also during the pandemic, that people think that they were not able to really comprehend the severity or the scale of the problem. And on similar lines, we're also as communicators, experts, we're using multiple terms, and many of them are also very complex, such as superbugs, AMR, and ABR, antibiotic resistance, drug resistance. So we're using multiple terms, and so people are unable to relate to AMR when if that audience or that public is more familiar with superbugs, so they're not going to understand what AMR means. And similarly, if they are more familiar with AMR and we start using drug resistance, so they might not be able to connect the dots and understand it's the same thing. So we again have to work on having very consistent messaging, consistent framing, and have the same sort of language and words, that terms that we use to talk about this problem. And of course, another big problem that we encountered in our public engagement program was, whether oversimplifying the science or the public health impact of AMR would lead to some sort of misinformation. And we did see that in our interactions with our audience, that many of them thought that, what we're really trying to say is that we should stop taking antibiotics because antibiotics are bad and they are giving rise to these superbugs. But that is not the case. And similarly, I'm sure this is something that most of you must have come across while talking about antibiotic resistance, is that people think that they have become resistant to antibiotics and not the microorganism or the bug. So we also have to kind of strike a very good balance between between simplifying science and oversimplifying it to the extent that it may lead to some sort of misinformation. And yes, of course, if there are any thoughts in addition to what I have put up on the screen, I would love to also hear from you guys. And then, while we're talking about AMR and framing of AMR so that we are able to take this message, this urgent message to the public, I think there are some certain ideas that I quite liked and some ideas that we have come across in our work. And I'm just going to share those with you. So I've kind of categorized them into science, the public health impact, and the kind of action that we are asking people to take. So how do we frame these three different communication categories? And so in science, of course, like I mentioned earlier at the start of this presentation, that we need to use very simple, straightforward, and non-technical language to convey scientific principles underlying AMR. And this you will have to, of course, there's a lot of literature out there on how you could do that. There are a lot of programs that have kind of figured out the recipe for how you could simplify AMR, but you would also have to do a bit of experimentation with your own audience to see what is the right way and most effective way of taking the scientific principles to your audience. It's also very important to not overwhelm your audience with too much information. I think we tend to do that because we know so much and we want to share all that we know with our audience, and then we end up overwhelming them and confusing them. So I think it's important, again, to, like I mentioned earlier, we need to prioritize the information depending on our audience and just give them enough to help them make sense of the problem. They don't need to know the entire literature around AMR, but just enough so that they're able to make sense of why is AMR a problem and how does that affect me and what is that I can do to address this problem. And again, I mentioned earlier, visual tools are very effective. We have used in our program with young children, we used a variety of visual tools because we knew that our audience would respond most favorably to visual tools, like be it comics or videos, or maybe more activity-based programs. So you have to basically understand your audience well and see what are some of the tools that would work best for your audience and what kind of visuals would work best with your audience. And of course, this is something I've also mentioned earlier is you have to know your audience's prior scientific knowledge and the vocabulary that they use, even when they're talking about science or health. So that's something that you'll have to keep in mind while you are framing the science of AMR. And when we talk about impact, I guess this is something that I briefly mentioned earlier, is that we need to humanize AMR. A lot of communication around AMR is through numbers and statistics and all of that. So I think we have to also make AMR a problem that is affecting people, and that people are at the heart of this problem. And I think we in general, as objective people of science and health, we tend to focus more on facts, evidence, data, numbers, and not so much at the at people and how those things are actually impacting in people's lives. So I think that is what will help in making the impact more relatable and more tangible to your audience if you humanize it. It also has to be positioned as a cross-cutting threat and not as a single disease. It's also another very important point that the reframing resistance report by Wellcome Trust mentioned, is that you have to frame it as an undermining that the AMR is actually undermining modern medicine, and that this would highlight the urgency for action. So that that antibiotics are not working, and if you don't do anything about it, then even the simplest of infections could kill us, which were earlier treatable. So it's important to use these kind of framings to underline and emphasize on the urgency for action. And it's also important to emphasize that it affects everyone, irrespective of their economic, social status. And so therefore you have to also frame it in a way that it conveys to your audience that it also affects them, and not people in a certain category or certain kind of strata of society. And lastly, I think when we're talking also about impact, it should not be doom and gloom, because that would lead to paralysis, and people will not action paralysis, and that would not really elicit any action from your audience. So you have to frame AMR as a solvable problem, and because only then will people engage in the problem and would want to address and solve it. And then finally, actions to address AMR. Of course, there's a lot of evidence. There is a lot of scientific evidence out there that we package and say that, hey, if we do this, we will be able to address the problem of AMR. And so the call to action messages for different audiences might be different. So, the call to action for a pharmacist may be different. The call to action for a poultry farmer might be different. And for a pharmaceutical, a person working in the pharmaceutical industry might be different. So we have to have very clear call to action for our respective audiences, and of course, for the society at large as well. And it's very important for us to kind of unpack what responsible use of antimicrobials entails for your audience, how they might be contributing towards the factors that might be driving AMR. And it's also important that, there's a really nice quote in the reframing resistance report, where if you take action now is a bit foggy, is what one of the respondents of the survey said, that you're asking me to take action now, but if we take action now, so how is that today, tomorrow, 2 weeks from now, 3 years from now? So I think we have to be very clear in our messaging, in our call to action, and be specific about what is that we want from our what kind of action we would want our audience to take. And so this is really my final slide, and I would love to hear your thoughts and your ideas on this topic after this, and I would just leave you with these final thoughts, which are really the messages and action. I would again reiterate, you would like your receiver to take should be very clear and to the point and specific. Also, science communication or health communication is a process. So you have to do it to learn, and while there are a lot of recipes out there are a lot of templates that you could follow, but you will really gain a better understanding of how you could communicate effectively is when you see it as a process and not just as a destination. And I think that's when you'll be able to do this more effectively, I guess. So, and of course, one size will not fit all for any type of communication. So that's something that we have to bear in mind as we set out to design or develop any communication strategy. And another very important point that I would like to leave you with is that any sort of advocacy has to strike balance between the emotional and fact-driven appeal. I mean, you would notice that a lot of the viral videos actually strike an emotional chord, and that's why people like them, and that's why they circulate them, and they, and that's what a lot of fake news and fake news content also uses is these tropes of striking that emotional chord in your audience. So similar kind of strategy has to be used also for any kind of advocacy or communication, that there needs to be a good balance between emotions and facts. And finally, of course, I think it's important to realize that you may be one of the many actors that are needed to kind of frame and communicate the problem of AMR, so that to close the whole awareness to action gap. So it's not merely enough to raise awareness. We also want people to take action, and so for that we need teams with different types of expertise, and we also need to bring in more participatory approaches where we take in feedback on what works and what doesn't work, and how is that we should be framing our message and so that it can actually influence the people that we are trying to influence. So yeah, so these are some of the final thoughts that I wanted to share, and I really like what Jeremy Farrar, who's the director of Wellcome Trust, said is that I wish the facts simply spoke for themselves, because that's what most of the academics and think. But the evidence is clear that they don't, and therefore we need to proactively communicate and find the best ways, the most creative and innovative ways to communicate about science and health. And these are some of the few resources that you could look up for this campaign, for this advocacy toolkit. And yeah, and that's all from my side. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a wonderful presentation. I would say, we have kind of managed to give the listeners a well-rounded idea about the whole science communication landscape. So starting with Satya speaking about the challenges in communicating about public health issues, followed up by Dhyani and Avinash speaking on incorporating design thinking into public health communication messages, and topped up by you about how to decipher or kind of unpack the complexities of science communication. So thank you so much for all these. Now the floor is open for questions. Any questions, comments, anything? You can either use the chat box or you can unmute and speak.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Sarah, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. No, basically, it was very clear and crisp. So, but then one thing which I always find is like whenever we have this communication with, with the public, I always doubt whether it has actually reached them. How do we know if the communication was effective? How do we identify that particular part?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point you raised, Haifa, and I think that also gives a lot of us who are in the communication and engagement space sleepless nights. So I think it's important while you're designing your communication plan or strategy to also incorporate evaluation. How are you going to evaluate the effectiveness of your communication strategy? And so that basically should be part of the process, and it really depends on the kind of project or program that you are spearheading. So, but there needs to be a component of evaluation. I think that, I'm really glad you raised that point.
Yeah, like so any sort of like if public health evaluation strategies can be like taken in that context,
exactly.
Like a PRP or anything can be done.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I chip in?
Yeah, sure.
Please go ahead.
I am Salman from Lucknow. In fact, I am not a PhD or a postgraduate in science. I did my basic science graduation from Allahabad University way back in 1981. But I'm interested in science, and specifically when it relates to the common man. And as is known that a lot of deaths are predicted from this antimicrobial resistance. My question to you is, Sarah, is that in the third world, lack of hygiene and lack of clean water leads to infection, and that often leads to chronic and prolonged illness.
That's
so
right.
what are your plannings for this specifically?
Yes. So, of course, I think, like I mentioned earlier in my presentation, that AMR is a multifaceted, a multi-dimensional problem, and it has a very important component. Of course, is prevention of infections. That's how we could actually address the problem of AMR, and in countries like India, where the wash practices are very poor, it is a very critical driver of AMR. So as part of the health awareness around AMR, or the kind of work that this group is doing, they will also be looking at how we could improve wash practices so that we can actually prevent infections to begin with, so that we don't require an antibiotic. And so there's a lot of work that we'll have to do upstream and both downstream of AMR. So upstream would be prevention, and downstream would be how do we address the irresponsible use of antibiotics and misuse of antibiotics.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions, thoughts? Philip, you were going to say something.
No, I was just going to ask whether any questions or comments or suggestions are there.
Yeah.
But I don't see anything coming our way, even in the chat box. So probably we can call it a day, Sarah.
Sure.
Thank you so much for sparing your time. I know that you have a very busy schedule nowadays.
My pleasure.
A lot of changes are also happening. So all put together, thank you so much for coming over and spending 45 minutes for us. It was a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you so much.
This was a very useful information session.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So have a nice day. Have a nice weekend.
Everyone have a nice day, and all the best